In the name of the king, I declare sentence upon you. If you are evil spirits, you must be destroyed. If you are mortal, as you claim, our world cannot support you. In either case, you must be destroyed. You will die in the fire of Ishtar.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Rocco couldn't be here with us this evening as he's currently giving a lecture on new applications of galvanism at the University of Sydney School of Medicine. So I'm just flying solo here as we delve into a very special bonus episode by request of one of our $5 level patrons, also a personal favorite of mine and my father's, the Universal International classic, The Mole People. The Mole People began its run on the 1st of December 1956, doubled up with the independently produced Jewel Productions adventure film Kurosu, Beast of the Amazon. It was produced by William Allen, who managed the plurality of Universal's B science fiction and horror films during this time, as well as a lot of westerns, including The Creature from the Black Lagoon trilogy, It Came from Outer Space, This Island Earth, Tarantula, The Deadly Mantis, and The Land Unknown. Along with frequent collaborator Jack Arnold, Allen is synonymous with this silver age of Universal's House of Horrors, a time in which the allure of gothic horror, buoyed by a roster of icons, both the undead and cursed creatures themselves and the B-list stars associated with them, was falling out of favor for the topicality of Cold War sci-fi, with its emphasis on more generic and inhuman creatures rather than marquee monsters, the Atom Age and alien invasion instead of supernatural and moral monstrosity. In the case of the Mole People, this period in both Allen's career and B-movies in general sees a greater blurring of the lines between modern science fiction, with its emphasis on a specious sense of scientific and technological realism, and the sense of exploration and adventure more closely associated with the classic scientific romances of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While on a film-by-film basis, the works of the early Cold War era often expressed an at least nominal critique of modernity and dominant ideology, generically speaking, they are marked by a confidence and chauvinism, a cinema of horrors that is no longer weighed down by the pessimistic specter of the First World War and the Great Depression, but by the Second World War and New Deal's reinvigoration of America's sense of its own centrality and uniquely admirable purpose in the world. The Mole People was written by Laszlo Goreg and directed by Virgil W. Vogel. Unlike Jack Arnold, neither of these characters ended up being very prolific in the realm of cinema. Instead, the body of their work is primarily composed of TV writing and direction, respectively. Of the two careers, Goreg's was the spottiest, although he also, like our last episode's Nathan Jurin, had achieved a much higher level of industry distinction than most of his contemporaries before transitioning, or some might say plummeting, into the realm of drive-in schlock. The highlight of his career was a nomination along with Thomas Monroe and Richard Florney for an Academy Award for Best Story in 1945 for his work on the cheeky romantic comedy The Affairs of Susan. The rest of his career as a screenwriter, or a television writer for that matter, was never as august. Along with The Mole People, he also wrote the screenplay for The Land Unknown, released in 1957, produced by Allen and also directed by Vogel. He was also a co-writer along with George Worthing Yates of the Burt I. Gordon-directed Tarantula ripoff Earth vs. the Spider, released by American International Pictures in 1958. Besides television work, he wrote two more independent exploitation films in partnership with director Richard Rush before retiring from show business in 1963. For Vogel's part, he actually began working for Universal as an editor in the 50s and worked on such films as Mystery Submarine, Abbott and Costello Meets the Invisible Man, and Orson Welles' phenomenal border noir Touch of Evil. or at least the original 1958 theatrical cut, which differed substantially from Welles's original vision, but that's neither here nor there. Transitioning into direction, like Goreg, he worked primarily in television. He only directed 4 motion pictures, including The Mole People. The 3 others were The Kettles on Old MacDonald's Farm, a hillbilly comedy released in the same year as his next Universal monster movie, The Land Unknown, as already mentioned, and most bizarre of all, a Swedish-American co-produced alien invasion movie called Space Invasion of Lapland, which was distributed internationally as Terror in the Midnight Sun in 1959, and then a little over 2 years later in the US as Invasion of the Animal People, heavily edited with new footage courtesy of indie exploitation producer Jerry Warren, as a double feature with his own jungle horror movie, Terror of the Blood Hunters. Most of this stuff is just some interesting behind-the-scenes trivia, with the exception of The Land Unknown being that it's a rather narratively similar movie that once again ties together Alan, Goreg, and Vogel. None of this is particularly relevant to the Mole People. It's not going to illuminate some unique, overarching artistic or authorial vision behind the movie, or at least not significantly more than just doing the work of buckling down and unpackaging the film itself. My father and I began this podcast with a very ambitious purpose: to survey the history of classic B movies in order to provide a counter-narrative to the idea that they are largely artless, technically incompetent dreck fit mostly to be enjoyed masochistically or ironically. But very frequently, and it's going to continue to be a frequent occurrence, we're going to be faced with the historical and economic reality that the calculus behind making these movies, whether by major studios or independent and regional producers, was largely cynical, or at least mercenary. And that's a big hurdle to overcome, as in large part the dominant narrative that these sorts of films are cynical, artless dreck is symbiotic with another dominant popular understanding: that the artistic meaning or substance or credibility of a work, its very ability to be treated in good faith, is dependent upon an authenticated intent by the filmmakers that it should be treated this way. From this point of view, a film itself, as a proxy of the filmmakers, needs to act per se in good faith, deferring to the spectator, not the other way around. Particularly because it is the film, again, as a proxy for its makers and distributors, which is trying to get our money. Now, as a petty postmodern contrarian, I could totally satisfy myself with a glib reference to the death of the author, make my case that preoccupying ourselves with the intent of content creators and artists only disempowers our own creative faculties as readers and viewers in creating our own meanings, reifies our deference to elite institutions, etc., you get the point. But I'm not going to do that, because as much as I am going to recommend that people actually do read Roland Barthes, because it turns out there are lots of people who learn about Roland Barthes in high school and college, and their only takeaway is apparently that they think he has something personally against authors because he doesn't like when they, tell him his readings are wrong or something. I'm not going to dwell on that, because I think there's a much more baseline and common sense avenue where we can apprehend in good faith that even when a film is produced largely to be artless, cynical dreck, that not only does that not mean that the work itself is actually and essentially artless and cynical, but that it is often largely impossible for these works, as the amalgamations of multiple people, all operating within complex webs of economic, social, political, and cultural influence, all subject to discrete factors that they themselves may not be consciously aware of, and none of them really possessing a tyranny of meaning once the final work is released upon the world. It is largely often impossible that these works do not fundamentally escape being artless, cynical dreck. It's not that the creators are particularly nuanced in their artistic purpose, or even technically competent a lot of the time. It's that the sum total of external influences upon people and how they behave, regardless of their conscious intent, is so over-deterministic in terms of their behavior, what they produce, and even their intent behind it, that it's virtually impossible for a work itself to not be similarly nuanced. I think in the past that my father and I have done a sufficient job of demonstrating where it is possible to forego speculation about a filmmaker or filmmaker's conscious intent when interpreting some B movies, with our recent episodes on Bird-Eye Gordon's double feature Attack of the Puppet People and War of the Colossal Beast being a particularly good example. But I'm also going to reiterate a point I made in our episode on The Nth Man. I am far less concerned by whether or not the thematic content of a piece of popular art is intentional than I am in substantiating that there is a clear motivation behind the work. We often use them interchangeably, but I do not see motivation as being synonymous with intent. Intent itself is a very tricky thing. How often do you find yourself saying something or doing something only after you've established intent to yourself? It seems to me that human beings mostly only ever talk about intent after they've done something that, makes them look like an asshole, and then have to rationalize to themselves and to others that whatever the consequences of their deeds or words, that their brains were operating benignly. It seems patently obvious to me that what we call intent is not, at least in the vast majority of cases, actually a conscious mechanism of the mind that goes before the externalization of what we think. That intent is actually a highly malleable and post-conscious construction. Both in the realm of basic morality and ethics and in the realm of popular arts, I find it much more useful to talk about motivation, which, while sometimes being conscious to us, is largely unconscious, driving what we do, say, and produce in veritably instinctual and subaltern ways that, when broken down as mere sections in a sequence, becomes to me a far more compelling way of looking at something than post hoc intent. And that's all very good for justifying the critical reading of these types of films, but I am aware that I have not yet actually made a point about quality, either as a work of art or just as popular entertainment. So I want to be clear that I am also not making a relativistic argument, like that everything is subjective, that there is no such thing as objective quality or whatever. I believe very firmly in protecting the concept of art, even the popular arts, as an institution where there is a certain demand that it contribute in some substantive way to the elevation of the human experience. My specific bone to pick is that, while I respect how instrumental so bad it's good film culture has been in the very renewal of interest in, preservation, and restoration of, and yes, the very reappraisal and reevaluation of many B and exploitation movies as credible and significant works of popular art, that it has outlasted its popular relevance to the point that it has now deleteriously resulted in a film culture that confuses ritualistic consumption with literacy. Part of it is just a function of our oversaturated marketplace in the digital age, but another significant part of it is the marrying of classic film snobbery with a new generation weaned on postmodernity and the infinite regression into self-reference that comes from having your formative years being built on Disney and Spielberg movies, and then growing up to find that the marketplace is still dominated by fucking Disney and Spielberg movies. There's the most perverse mix in today's popular film culture and discourse between idolatry and bad faith. We are constantly binging on TV shows and then, complaining that movies are getting too long. We are constantly championing whatever festival darling of the moment and then treating any mainstream blockbuster that doesn't narrowly conform to the narrative models and aesthetics of 80s Hollywood classics as inherent failures, ensuring that there is never any actual challenge to the medium in any particular space. We find ourselves getting insulted when Martin Scorsese tells us that superhero movies are theme park rides and not cinema. Because in our puerile minds we equate his valuation of cinema with saying that we are wrong when we think that superhero movies are good, when what he's actually doing is criticizing the hegemony of major studio monopolies and its consequent infantilization of spectators in pursuit of the broadest and least controversial demographics possible. We are so lost in this puerile eternal peanut gallery that our very sexual development has been compromised. Folks, people are turned on by cats. How fucking boring does your sex life need to be turned on by dancing cats? Now, I know it's odd to lay even an iota of blame at the feet of the bygone hecklers of Mystery Science Theater 3000 and the then marginal film culture that produced them, but you have to remember that this show's mockery of these films was often counterbalanced with a very obvious idolatry of, quote, real cinema. There was one episode where, in the midst of heckling an American edit of a Soviet fantasy film, they did a sketch which was a loving parody of Ingmar Bergman movies. They made fun of Leonard Maltin once by reading through all the classic films that he'd given lower star ratings than whatever they were watching for that episode. Yes, these guys were masochistic nerds, but they were also certifiable dilettantes. It's not like they just went away. These guys are all still pottering around, and they aren't just making fun of old movies anymore. They're now doing, like, major mainstream blockbusters and live shows, with them. And guess what? It's not funny anymore. At a certain point, what was marginal became the mainstream. What was a joke became legitimate criticism. And now we're in a position, just a constant noise of heckling. This is what happens when a lot of people's ideas of how you distinguish good filmmaking from bad filmmaking, this instinctual response to the perceived essence of a work, is predicated on a show about people watching movies and never shutting the fuck up, cutting out entire pieces of the plot to make room for 9 minutes of commercials every half hour, plus sketches and musical numbers. I'm not saying you need to turn off your brain to appreciate these movies. I'm saying we need to go further than that. We need to understand that this constant heckler mentality is not good for cinema as an institution, and it's not good for us as people. It's not that we need to turn off our brains to appreciate the quality of every cynical piece of dreck that falls down the chute. It's that we need to shut the fuck up. We need to watch these films with an eye to actually listen and pay attention to them, and not just waiting for our turn to speak about them. Because it's not a conversation. The film cannot treat you in good faith. We have to do that. And, Jesus, that was a while. I've been talking about this for 17 minutes. Okay, that's gonna be the last time I'm even going to talk about that, I promise. That's the last episode I'm ever gonna rant about that sort of thing. The Mole People is the story of an archaeologist, Dr. Roger Bentley, played by John Agar, who, along with a research team, happens upon a subterranean kingdom of ancient Mesopotamians trapped inside a mountain somewhere in the Himalayas. But the film does not open with Bentley's expedition, but with this guy.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's amazing how much we know about the surface of our globe. In the last 100 years, men have progressively studied this, explorations.
Unbeknownst to most people who watch the film today, this character, a Dr. Frank C. Baxter, is not an actor playing the formulaic role of an introductory expert. He is, in fact, a real-life doctor of English literature who taught and lectured at the University of Southern California. An interesting bit of pop culture trivia, though, Baxter had actually become something of a TV personality contemporary to the production of the film, so his casting in the film was likely seen as a very fortuitous get for the producers. He was best known for playing the character Dr. Research for the Bell System Science series of television specials produced by the AT&T Corporation, acting as a host, narrator, and lecturer as the audience was toured through various scientific subjects, despite the fact that Baxter himself was not a doctor of the sciences. He also appeared throughout the mid-50s and early 60s as himself, hosting and lending commentary to various series more particular to his actual literary discipline, including 28 episodes of the anthology drama Telephone Time, as well as 2 series focused on the works of William Shakespeare, Shakespeare on TV in 1953, and the U.S. broadcast of the BBC series An Age of Kings in 1961. Consistent more with his Dr. Research character, Baxter appears here again acting as a formulaic expert who ostensibly provides a certain credibility to the fantastic science fiction movie we are about to watch. But his role here in The Mole People is fairly unique. Most expository openings to 50s science fiction films were done simply with a narrator rather than an actor who appears in person, and Baxter's unassuming and dreamy persona is certainly at odds with the chauvinistic bravado of many expository narrators ranting about the nuclear arms race or the American national security state's advanced technology, etc., etc. But it should also be noted that behind the pseudo-scientific balderdash that Baxter notably fumbles through, like that man has managed to successfully chart the majority of the Earth's surface, we haven't, especially not if you include, the ocean floor, or that there is a profound mystery as to the interior of our globe, which, I guess, if just basic inference doesn't matter. Behind all that, the information that Baxter is delivering to the audience is not necessarily directly related to the plot of the film, except in the most tangential and thematic sense.
Primitive man, going into caves, reaching back and down, wondered what lay beyond. And in terror, he fled out. And he remembered strange sighs and noises. Now you go back.
Rather, Baxter's meandering exposition is not about contemporary scientific research or technology, but is culled indiscriminately from sources that are more germane not only to his own literary discipline, but clearly to certain influences upon the imaginations of the filmmakers, particularly Gorig as screenwriter. It would be interesting to know whether Gorig himself actually wrote this scene in his original screenplay, or if it was only swiftly slapped together by himself or some stringer uncredited at some point in the production process. At any rate, the scene makes far more sense as an explication of the film's historical and literary influences, and thus as a contextual thematic framing device, than as a coherent expert commentary. Among the film's allusions, some are more straightforward than others, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient Sumerian epic poem which at one point depicts the descent of the posthumously deified King Gilgamesh into the terrifying underworld, though there's also a notable reference to the Inferno of Dante's The Divine Comedy.
Dante, the great Dante, saw a great cone-like cavity stretching down to the very center of the earth.
Now, note that Baxter, in character, never mentions that Dante is describing hell. Indeed, through this expository lecture, his script alludes broadly to how mythologies of world religions have variously conceived of there being an underworld, while never making a distinction between what it calls some inner habitable world and what may be actually allegorical representations of an afterlife. It's from there that we move on into the real meat of this lecture, which are various hollow earth theories, complete with illustrated companions. First, we're introduced to a variant of the hollow earth popularized by John Cleves Sims in 1818, which proposed that there were openings at the poles of the planet Earth through which one could descend through successive layers to the ultimate center and then presumably back out again. While Hollow Earth hypotheses date back as far as the 17th century in Europe, Baxter's script notably begins from a North American context, even deigning to mention Sims' service in the War of 1812, although even calling him a minor hero of the war is a bit of a stretch. Baxter then moves on to what the script refers to rather cheekily as Cyrus Reed Teed's revelation, first proposed in the 1870s, that what we perceive to be the outside of our globe is actually the inside, that all space beyond us is actually our flawed perception of the vast inner sanctum of an inescapable globe that we are looking up into and not up and out of. The line revelation here is clearly an Easter egg by whoever wrote the script, which leads me to believe that Gorig is not only totally responsible for this part of the film's screenplay as well, but that he has a much more tongue-in-cheek agenda, at least with this scene. For you see, Teed's revelation was not just some eureka moment. He wasn't just sitting in a bathtub or under a tree and realized, this is the nature of the world. Indeed, it's specious to even call his hollow earth theory a theory. You wouldn't call the revelations of Muhammad his theory, would you? No, you call them a revelation because it has a very specific spiritual connotation. It's not pseudo-scientific. The script describes Teed as a physician, but neglects to inform the audience that this 19th century physician was of that eclectic variety that practiced contemporary variations of New Age healing and holistic medicine, and that he was also an alchemist and a quack experimenter whose methodology often included dangerously high levels of electricity. It was during one such experiment in the autumn of 1869 that Teed was badly shocked and rendered unconscious, only to wake up with the revelation that he was to be the messiah of a new religion called Koreshanity, that's a hard one to pronounce, Koreshanity, devoted to the establishment of a new Jerusalem in North America, a communistic utopia that would be organized around a mixture of Teed's pseudo-scientific beliefs, including his hollow earth cosmology, and a synthesis of various articles of faith, including reincarnation, immortality, and the importance of celibacy. There is a third hollow earth theory mentioned, one allegedly proposed by one Karl Neupert, a German from the 1920s, virtually identical to Teed's revelation, though presumably without the alchemical and communistic cult parts. Though who really knows, I certainly can't find any English language references online to a Karl Neupert, and all that comes up is an apparently significant German architect and spatial planner living around the same time. But I'm not going to make any definitive claims there. Honestly, this part of the lecture is pretty half-hearted, and the script switches rather abruptly and anticlimactically to introducing the film proper.
So in this picture you're about to see, you'll see the culmination of a long series of such desires to look into the earth. One might well believe philosophically that some ancient culture, engulfed by a great and tremendous upheaval of nature, might linger on in some pocket of earth. This is science fiction, of course. It's a fiction. It's a fable beyond fiction. For I think if you'll study this picture and think about it when it's over, you'll realize that this is something more than just a story told. It's a fable with a meaning and a significance for you and for me in the 20th century. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, now, I just want to emphasize again that nothing that Baxter has talked about directly implies the sci-fi premise of the movie, that, quote, some ancient culture engulfed by a great and tremendous upheaval of nature might linger on in some pocket of the earth. He has previously only described either myths or crackpot theories about the inherent nature of the globe, its apparently persistent physical composition, and mankind's relationship to and beliefs about it. He has now suddenly changed course and is now describing the modern 20th century understanding of how the Earth is constantly and often cataclysmically subject to changes in its natural composition. This is where it's really important, again, to actually pay attention to these movies, because if you're only responding to the script or Baxter's performance, you're not really getting the joke. Like, I'm looking at the Wikipedia plot synopsis of the film right now, and right there it says, paraphrased, for simplicity's sake, Baxter says that the movie is a fictionalized representation of John Sims and Cyrus Teed's unorthodox theories. I'm sorry, no, that's not what Baxter says. This is what happens when you get your ideas of film study from Mystery Science Theater 3000, I'm afraid. Again, you get someone who might be very consummated when it comes to films like this, but is not at all literate when attempting to critique them. Okay, the entire speculative premise of the Mole People that Baxter suddenly introduces at the very end of this lecture, that cataclysmic events in the remote past can lead to the suspended animation of isolated, antiquated, or primitive environments and societies, is nothing like the myths of the ancient worlds, or the cosmologies of various religions or cults, or the crack pottery of failed tradesmen turned would-be explorers. It is much more directly related tautologically to the film's foundation and the clear foundation of Gorig's influences in weird fiction and classic adventure and scientific romance literature, with which Baxter himself would no doubt be familiar. Novels such as Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, and Edgar Rice Burroughs' At the Earth's Core and The Land That Time Forgot. Indeed, Alan Vogel and Gorig's follow-up to The Mole People, The Land Unknown, would take even more explicitly from these influences. And obviously it wasn't precisely uncommon for Hollywood producers to rehire the same stable of artists to do similar types of films over and over again, but the specific parallels between the speculative concepts of The Mole People and The Land Unknown say to me, at least, that there is a clear and authentic artistic motivation, if not an intent, behind these apparently artless and cynical pictures. I find it not at all difficult to imagine that for as many wide-sweeping historical, mythological, apocryphal, and literary influences that are woven into the beginning of this film, that its creators are, in fact, huge and enthusiastic nerds about them, and that their investment in this work has far more integrity than your average so-bad-it's-good heckler, again being very consummated, but not particularly literate, is going to pick up upon. But let's get closer to a thesis for this episode, on a reading of The Mole People. Baxter alleges that while the film is science fiction, it is also a fable beyond fiction. Now, this use of the word fable is the first and only time, really, at which Baxter truly emerges from behind the facade of as this doctor research personality, the generic expert who's ostensibly lending a scientific credibility to a balderdash movie to address the audience in terms of the film's narrative, acting as an extension of literary traditions which would actually be his area of expertise. Suffice it to say, though, the problem is that the use of parable here does not seem particularly apt for describing the narrative of the Mole People, nor what Baxter foregrounds as its explicitly rhetorical purpose, i.e., as a story with a meaning and a significance for you and for me in the 20th century. Fables, certainly at this point in academia, while often used interchangeably with narrative forms such as fairy tales or parables, are generally understood to be stories that use anthropomorphized animals, plants, objects, and even forces of nature themselves, like the sun or the wind, in order to tell didactic stories that deliver succinct and unambiguous morals. And while one could argue that the filmmakers have just bent the rules here, that The Mole People, telegraphing through its title, is a fable where the process of anthropomorphism is reversed, and natural forces are certainly personified, particularly as feminine entities, that still leaves us with the question of what precisely the moral of the film is. That does not mean that the film does not have a meaning and significance, but it's my position that fable simply does not adequately communicate the evidence or extent of that meaning or significance. The Mole People is certainly not a film with a didactic, unambiguous moral. If anything, rendered through Gorig's panoply of influences, surprisingly nuanced and subtle in parts, it is more accurately understood as allegory, which for our purposes can be understood to move beyond the naive conventions of a fable or a parable and its simplistic emphasis on personal moral character. Rather, an allegory offers a much broader kind of message, for lack of a better term, that addresses not merely good or bad behavior, but questions about the nature of the world itself and man's place within it, about our very perception of the world and how much we can trust it, and finally, the nature of power, who wields it, who it is wielded over, and to what ends. Our location, Asia. And and that's about as much geographical information as we're going to get. Presumably, Bentley's archaeological expedition is situated somewhere in the Indian or Nepalese Himalayas, but obviously there's no real sense of cultural or linguistic accuracy to draw upon. Bentley and his team discover a stone tablet at an unlikely level of strata in the rock that they're excavating, covered in a cuneiform that we are told is impossible in these parts, an assertion that Bentley roundly rejects.
You mean it's not probable, Lafarge? In archaeology, all things are possible.
Later on, Bentley is joined by the rest of his team, Dr. Judd Belliman, played by Hugh Beaumont, Professor Etienne Lafarge, played by Nestor Paiva, and Dr. Paul Stewart, played by Phil Chambers. Studying the tablet, we are told that the level of strata from which it was recovered was below the, quote, Great Flood level, placing it around 5,000 years old by their estimation. The reference here to the Great Flood is not a Christian creationist historical framework familiar to our moment, where evangelist pseudoscience now devotes entire foundations, websites, and even museums to the project of using piecemeal geological evidence to assert a literal interpretation of the Hebrew book of Genesis. Rather, the framework that is informing Goreg's screenplay is one of pan-Babylonianism, a school of historical, archaeological, and anthropological thought that is now largely discredited and, even at the time that the film was made, was in the process of being discredited, though it's not uncommon for creators of popular science fiction to draw either deliberately or non-deliberately from schools of scientific thought that are, even at the time of their writing, out of date. Pan-Babylonianism is an interpretation of evidence of Middle East, Asian antiquity that interprets all cultures and religions of the region's early civilizations as being rooted in Babylonian influence, with a complementary Bible-Babel school of thought regarding the mythology of the Hebrew Bible and Judaism in particular as being directly derived from Babylonian sources. It pays to return to Baxter's expository lecture for just a minute to see the script he recites and how it frames the filmmaker's own understanding of Mesopotamian civilization.
Now you go back to Mesopotamia and the beginning of Western civilization.
Now, notice that Baxter, in character at least, describes Mesopotamia as being the root of Western civilization as opposed to, say, Middle Eastern Asian civilization. You know, you might almost get the feeling that the white European settlers who made this film have a rather narrow definition of civilization itself. But while it's enough to deride this content as evidence of contemporary racism and Eurocentrism, I'd like to get more specific, principally because, unfortunately, we are living in a moment where we're seeing a distinct revival in far-right policies and culture throughout North America and Europe, which is incredibly and fanatically invested in propagating this idea of Western civilization, and you can put that in scare quotes, as it's not just a historically and geographically specific phenomenon that's being described there, but it's specifically a foundational myth of the essential purity of European and white settler societies, seeing itself as the only truly legitimate form of human civilization. What both Baxter's expository lecture and the incidental dialogue at the beginning of the film proper points to is a narrative framework in which all antiquity, from Sumerians to Babylonians to Hebrews, represents only a hyper-diffusion of a single civilizing source that is the unique and particular legacy of modern Europeans and white settlers. This is even going to be reflected when we finally get to the hidden Sumerian kingdom that Bentley and his team discover in one of the Himalayan mountains, which is populated by albinos, but where there are still certain individuals, such as Bentley's eventual love interest, Adad, played by Cynthia Patrick, who still have pigmentation of the skin and hair. Of course, Adad's natural skin color, that one that we can infer is supposed to be recessively descendant of the real Sumerians, is still light-skinned and blue-eyed. In other words, she's Caucasian. At the time that the Mole People was made, a Caucasian, or even worse, a Caucasoid person was not necessarily synonymous with a white person as it is in our contemporary moment. Rather, it referred to a taxonomic category of ethnicities that included so-called Aryans throughout most of Europe, Semitic peoples of the Mideast, Asia, and Hamitic peoples of North Africa. But the image of Cynthia Patrick cannot, I think, merely be described as broadly Caucasian. It does not refer to all of these potential groups, the Aryan, the Semitic, and the Hamitic. No, it is referring to specifically this particular mythologizing of the Aryan, of this thing that is comorbid with these pan-Babylonian and Bible-Babel schools, of this idea of there being a pure white Aryan who is the essence of all civilization. So obviously the Mole People is racist and exclusionary. Shockingly, a movie made in America in the mid to late 50s was racist and exclusionary. It is a narrative that is dependent upon a specific conception of the modern civilized world as emanating from some remote past where one particular type of people is part of a unique grand narrative of human progress. Not only that, but we could say that this reverberation of Aryan essentialism even boomerangs back through Bentley and his team of white settler and European archaeologists, who are, of course, taking the center stage in a quest to uncover and preserve human history, whereas these vaguely defined Asians, these extras mostly being portrayed by white performers in brownface, although there is a Native American performer who is playing one of the speaking roles, though that it's kind of humiliating anyway. But anyway, whereas these vaguely defined Asians are merely employed to help them, and all of their own histories are basically only of tangential relevance. Again, it's like a hyper diffusion from a single essential source. But even accepting this, what if there is an allegorical function to the film? What if this allegorical function is also, at least, nominally critical of these characters? What if, even if it blatantly accepts now discredited race science and Eurocentric mythology, what if it is also subverting the grand narrative of these modern Aryans rediscovering their arcane heritage? What if the discovery of this legacy in a Lovecraftian sense is supposed to be revealing something much darker and problematic to the entire mythological framework of the modern world? Well, for now, let's just focus on character, particularly Bentley as our protagonist. I've seen The Mole People many, many times, but rewatching it for this survey was really the first time I actually started paying attention to it as a narrative driven by Bentley as a central character, rather than the way I used to view it, which was as a narrative driven by fantastical and spectacular events into which Bentley merely stumbles as our archetypical explorer and white male hero. And I'm sure that's really the way that most people initially at least view the movie, as a series of events and not a character study. Gorig's script is mostly focused on making Bentley generically identifiable. He's strong, he's the determined American with a sense of humor, blah blah blah, while also conserving dialogue largely to what advances the story or explains what the audience couldn't pick up on otherwise. But even here, there's a duality to Bentley as a figure that, while not overplayed either by Gorig's script or even John Agar's serviceable performance, it certainly becomes unignorable as we do begin to approach the film's narrative not as merely a sequence of spectacular events, but as a function of Bentley's arc as a protagonist. What we can glean from the first line I excerpted, the part about all things being possible in archaeology, about all those things, is that Bentley is something of a devoted practitioner of his field, maybe even more idealistic than his collaborators. But inexplicably, in the scene where the team is investigating the tablet, Bentley says the following.
Stewart, every time I think of how many civilizations have crumbled, fallen apart, rotted from the inside or cracked from the outside, I shudder when I pick up the front page of a newspaper.
The translation, Bentley.
It's an interesting bit of characterization. It tells us that Bentley doesn't just see his discipline as being about the rediscovery of our collective history, albeit the exclusionary white collective history, but about learning from the past. Evidently, he's highly critical of the modern world. Now, who knows what things in newspapers are leading Bentley to fear for the decline of Western civilization. Maybe he thinks Rome was destroyed by immigration or some shit, who knows. But I think the aside is efficient enough that and just generic enough that it's going to be indispensable as a point of reference for when the characters actually do encounter the living fossil that is this isolated Sumerian kingdom. And I do think that we are already clearly seeing evidence that the story Goreg is crafting is ultimately subversive, even if it is inevitably endemic of non-subversive, unsubverted racism of the time. After translating the inscription on the tablet, which curses whoever maliciously defaces or removes it by invoking the goddess Ishtar, there is an earthquake, and in the process, the tablet is destroyed. The characters, being the sensible, objective scientists that they are, joke about the ominousness of this coincidence, but pay attention to what Bentley himself says in regards to it.
You think the goddess of Ishtar is punishing us for removing the tablets, Lafarge?
The inscription said, "He who removes it with malice." But we aren't malicious, are we? We want to rescue the Sharu dynasty from oblivion. That's what archaeologists are for, no?
Archaeologists are underpaid publicity agents for deceased royalty.
You buys your ticket and you takes your chance. I believe in grabbing for the gold ring every time.
Think I hear a little bit of John Wayne tinge in Agar's performance there. But what an interesting exchange. Just so all the circumstantial stuff is clear, the epicenter of the earthquake is 25 miles away under a mountain called Kuitara, which is, of course, the place where the hidden Sumerian kingdom that Bentley's expedition is trying to, as Lafarge says, rescue from oblivion. That's where it actually is. That's where the earthquake came from. However, it's Lafarge who jokes that the purpose of their expedition isn't malicious, that it is noble. Why should they be cursed by the goddess? Again, this is the sort of rather good character work that's so bad it's good film culture doesn't act in good faith enough to acknowledge. That the point of the scene is to both further characterize Bentley as well as to clarify subversively what the actual role of these supposedly noble objective scientists is. It turns out that the seemingly idealistic Bentley is slightly more nuanced and even blatantly cynical. He literally compares what they are doing to a gold rush prospecting and stealing from the dead. That's what the John Wayne affectation and the grabbing for the gold ring means, respectively. No wonder Ishtar is angry, despite what Lafarge says, despite how the archaeologists code what they are doing in sarcastic humor. They are no more or less than grave robbers. They are excavating the past for their own cynical ends. So there's this duality to Bentley as a protagonist. On the one hand, he is legitimately in awe at what he discovers and devoted to uncovering it, even if it means great peril to himself. And to other people, as it turns out. You know, obviously a lot of other of his team die, and he gets out scot-free. But anyway, but on the other hand, he sees himself as being a prospector, someone who is setting out into the wilderness to make his own fortune, with a largely pessimistic view of the modern world and what he sees as its inevitable fate, all that he's leaving behind. That first aside in the tent isn't the only allusion to this either. It comes up again after the expedition moves to scaling Kuitara itself. This is how Bentley responds after a particularly intense moment where the characters are bedding down for the night, but can hear an avalanche raging just outside somewhere, fearing that it's going to be crushing down on them at any second.
This mountain's hundreds of square miles in area. You're only occupying 1 square foot.
Sitting here is a lot safer than crossing Times Square.
I don't care. I don't care who you are. That's a clever line. Anyway, in the middle of the conversation following the initial earthquake, the one that shatters the tablet, a shepherd boy delivers an object to the team which turns out to be a gold lamp in the shape of a boat, with inscriptions representing pairs of people and animals. The group concludes that this is evidence corroborating the Sumerian version of the Great Flood. So there's that pan-Babylonianism again. They find out it came from Kuitara, so like you do, we're off and up Kuitara. Consistent with the correlation between the curse of Ishtar and the epicenter of the earthquake, Gorg's script continues its identification between the goddess and the mountain. The closest aspect of the narrative to a fable, Kuitara becomes personified and is specifically presented as a feminine entity, in a manner common in two representations of earthly nature.
Peaceful looking, isn't she?
The thing that impresses me the most is the complete and utter silence. You can almost hear it.
Don't let her fool you, Mr. Bentley. When she wants to, she can scream so loud as to make you deaf. And you will hear her, and quite soon. I think perhaps even tonight.
As the team gets closer to the summit of Kuitara, the mountain and its forces become progressively identified with Ishtar. There's a particularly successful and unnerving image in the film after another avalanche, which delivers to the team the severed arm of a statue. Reaching up and out of the snow, it's a very ghostly image that, like all of those personifications of nature, blurs the line between the protagonist's prejudices in favor of scientific objectivity and the clearly supernatural nature of what is going on in the story. Other motifs, like the whiteness of the snow as well as the statues venerating Ishtar herself, also reinforce the Aryan essentialism of the film's view of history, but in a way that does not associate them with some grand narrative of progressive enlightenment, but rather with, as Bentley foreshadows about the modern world itself, a civilization that is crumbling, falling apart, rotted from the inside, or cracking from without. Interestingly, the society that lives within Kuitara will turn out to fall apart for a combination of precisely those reasons. Rotted from the inside by its own corruption and ignorance, and cracked from the outside by Bentley's own influence. It is Bentley himself who is perhaps becoming the corrosive outsider who really does prove to be the bane of this civilization. Reaching the summit, they find the remains of a temple, but soon after, Stewart falls into a hollow pit beneath the earth, forcing the team to go after him. He's dead once they arrive, and another cave-in traps them as well. This is great contrasting imagery that Gorg plays with. We begin with an ascension into an enveloping white, the characters in search of knowledge and glory, grabbing for the gold ring, Bentley in awe at the penetrating silence of nature, and then, cowering from its almighty force, only for them to have to then descend down back into a world of darkness. This inversion of motifs comes to frame the first of the film's allegorical projects that, far from directly transcribing Hollow Earth theories, is merely using them as a loose literary inspiration. Again, the film is not about a Hollow Earth, but about a society that has been isolated and placed in a state of kind of suspended animation by some bygone cataclysm. But just like Sim's theory, the characters have needed to scale the Earth in order to find a portal to its interior secrets, which also happens to be the plot of Journey to the Center of the Earth. And just like Teed's revelation, the kingdom of this subterranean world believes that when they are looking up, they are looking out, perceiving the full scope of the world, when in reality, they are looking up and only into their limited framework.
There is no world beyond ours.
There is only heaven, where we lived a long time ago, until we were expelled for our sins amidst thunder and fire.
This is the world, and we are its people. You are not of us. There is heaven, and only the gods live there. Would you tell us that you are gods?
That's the High Priest Elenu speaking, played by Alan Napier. who serves as the film's primary antagonist, and the more we see of him and his kingdom, the more we apprehend about the subversive quality of the film. Obviously, there's the consistent subversion of our protagonists and their scientific objectivity. Up and to the point where they are captured by the Sumerians, they believe that the world into which they have descended is merely a crypt of the dead. As Bentley puts it, referring again to the idea of the Sumerian and Hebrew flood myths emanating from a single historical event.
Children of Noah survived. The children of Ishtar died.
But they did not die. The children of Ishtar are just as living as the children of Noah. Or are they? It turns out that this kingdom is one that is highly organized around a fetishism of human sacrifice, a form of population control that is necessary because their environment can only sustain a few hundred people. So this decrepit city, full of these albino, pale, ghostly people, shrouded in constant darkness and worshipping death, are they truly living? Or is this a city of the undead? Is this merely a tangible, inhabitable underworld, or is it a kind of hell? Is the world of light above its own tangible, inhabitable world, or is it actually an ethereal plane inaccessible to mere mortals? Is the earthquake or the avalanche merely a force of nature, or is it the will of Ishtar? These are all matters of perception, you see. But going even further than that, this narrative inversion, from Bentley's ascent of Kuitara to his descent into this underworld, it is also subversive in how it carries certain motifs of Aryan essentialism. The white snow, the white statues, the albino Sumerians who, as it happens, are only seen at first in glimpses of the courtly and priestly class who practice a kind of eugenics and, as it happens, displace all the hardest labor of their society onto the backs of the brutally oppressed slaves, the titular mole people. All of these point to an inversion of various ways in which Western civilization and white supremacy are fetishized, now portrayed as unambiguously cruel and ignorant. Even the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Adad, who would pass in any society above the surface, is made a slave by this albino society because the very presence of any pigmentation at all is described as the mark of darkness, a sign of the original sin that, in the society's myths, saw them cast out of their rightful place among the gods. Of course, this ontological framing of dark sin as being a literal representation of the sinfulness of certain types of people and their inherent apartness from the divine has itself been historically used by major religions, particularly European Christianity, as a justification for oppression and enslavement and colonization. And it seems clear that that's exactly what the filmmakers are presenting in this allegorical form. Again, everything being a matter of perception, the suspended Mesopotamian Aryan peoples are, to the protagonists, the roots of Western white civilization. But they are also then necessarily a microcosmic representation of this civilization's true nature, in which signifiers of Aryan essence are amplified to a point of grotesquerie, and where the grand narratives of the superiority and progress of Western civilization are rendered moot by their foundation upon brutality. A world of unremitting darkness that can never ascend to ethereal heights that only ever exists in a remote, mythologized past, whereas the truth of the matter is obviously grotesque and horrific, and immediately Bentley and his colleagues want to get the hell out of Dodge. So, just to summarize the rest of the plot, Bentley and his last surviving partner, Bellaman, are able to survive by using a flashlight, to which the albino Sumerians are painfully sensitive, in order to convince the king and court that they are actually gods. They survive for a little while, and in the meantime, they get to witness the oppression of the mole people who, while looking quite savage and being unable to speak, still possess the power to reason. Elenu remains unconvinced of their divinity and eventually succeeds after having the flashlight taken from the pair in condemning them to death. Fortunately, the episodes in which Bentley and Bellamy rescue some of the mole people from being abused pays off in their coming to their rescue, organizing a massive slave revolt in which Elenu and the entire court of the king are slaughtered. It's actually very entertaining and, kind of cathartic. They even manage to bring Adad to the chamber where the pair have been locked away to be sacrificed to Ishtar, where it's revealed that the fire that consumes the sacrificial victims is actually just a shaft of light to which most of the people of this society are too sensitive to endure. Bentley and Bellamy, along with Adad, scale the shaft back to the surface, only for another earthquake to start, during which Adad is killed. And that's where the movie ends, Adad dying in Bentley's arms. Again, viewed as merely a narrative of spectacular events, it's easy to trace the mole people as one kind of allegory, in which a microcosmic Aryan civilization is destroyed by a combination of its own internal corruption as well as the malicious influence of outsiders. But there is also a related allegory, expressed uniquely through following the narrative as a function of Bentley's own arc as a protagonist. Beginning on a cynical quest for glory, antipathetic to what he sees as the inherent corruption and inevitable fate of modern civilization, he goes in search of an awe-inspiring past, a world of fascinating objects free of the inconvenient nature of man. His desires, however, ultimately lead him only to a world of living death, a world of corruption and cruelty, even more rarefied than the one he left behind. The Mole People, as a narrative reflecting Bentley's unique subjective, becomes an allegory for one who has himself believed that he perceived the true nature of the world, but coming to realize that all he understood were shadows of the truth. To grasp the true nature of things, he must be willing to confront the blinding light of truth itself, which is both attractive and terrifying. The journey to that truth is represented in two ways. One is through the personification of nature through Ishtar herself, which is represented by fire and light. Although the albino Sumerians invoke Ishtar in their death cult, the reality is that the very thing that represents Ishtar to them is only that which facilitates their continued power over their world. They themselves only understand a world of shadows, but never perceive the true nature of the world, much less the true nature of Ishtar. When Bentley, Bellamy, and Adad stand living in the sacrificial chamber, the shaft of light, their path to escape and redemption, it is literally shaped like the symbol that these Sumerians used to represent the Eye of Ishtar. Far from the purely malevolent figure who causes earthquakes and avalanches, who seeks only to do away with meddlesome outsiders, Ishtar is revealed to also be a redeeming figure, one who has actually been calling Bentley and Bellamy to act as her handmaidens in exacting justice upon those who have blasphemed in her name. Needing to ascend through this eye to return to the world, Ishtar also becomes not only the personification of the mountain Kuitara, but of the entire world itself, its true nature as both a mother of darkness and destruction, as well as of birth and new life and light and deliverance from evil. The second way in which Bentley's journey towards truth is represented is more palpable. One avenue is through this recognition of the humanity of the Mole People. Presented in the trailers for the film as merely bloodthirsty monsters, the actual film unambiguously presents the Mole People as a sympathetic, empathetic, and reasoning people. By establishing common ground with them, first Bentley helps the Mole People, then the Mole People rescue Bentley. His journey towards truth and redemption is resolved through a subversive severing of his identification with these albino Sumerians and the grotesque Aryan essentialism they represent, and coming to a new identification with all of those darker, diffused, hyper-diffused, colonized, and enslaved peoples upon whose exploitation these civilizations were actually built. The other avenue is, more obviously, through his developing romance with Adad herself, who explicitly becomes a living personification of Ishtar. It's through a conversation with Adad that we see the clearest indication that he's not merely being an agent of the film's spectacular events, but is a character undergoing a redeeming transformation. At first cynical about the world above, he no longer sees Adad's inability to distinguish between the real world and heaven as merely a function of her ignorance. He himself has also been ignorant, perceiving only shadows of his own projection rather than the true nature of things.
There's nothing beyond darkness, my lord.
Are you sure of that? Have you never in your life heard of a world of light above the darkness?
No, my lord. Never.
Well, then let me tell you about it. The world of light changes color with every heartbeat. There are mighty rivers and places where the land is covered with living things. And then there are the cities. Beautiful cities. Filled with many people, like you and me.
You're speaking of heaven, my lord.
Maybe I am. Maybe I am.
Now, a lot of you have probably already predicted what all of these motifs of a world of false forms and shadows separated from a world of light above the darkness, of a blinding light of truth that is both attractive and terrifying, of a subterranean world of shackles and imprisonment. You've already guessed what I'm going to assert that these things are transparent allusions to. It's certainly not any of the ones that make up Baxter's expository lecture, though those are important, but it is an allegory that appears to me to be absolutely essential to understanding the entire film. I'm speaking, of course, of Plato's allegory of the cave described in Republic. Narrated by Plato's mentor Socrates, the allegory of the cave posits to the reader and prospective philosopher that living in the world in which we have been born, raised, and taught, but without the illumination of some other entity or force, is like being a prisoner in a cave, shackled to a rock so that one is only ever facing one direction. Light passes through the cave, casting shadows of the forms that cross it, but the prisoners do not perceive these shadows as mere shadows. They perceive them as the whole and inherent nature of things. In the allegory, the path of a philosopher is like one who has found themselves suddenly freed from their shackles and turns to face the light, realizing the awe-inspiring but also terrifying truth that everything they knew before was a lie. That there is a higher reality of pure forms that they now comprehend, but which they cannot communicate to their fellow prisoners who remain shackled, who know nothing of this world of light above the darkness, and do not wish to, because the world of shadows is all they know, and is sufficient enough for them. In the allegory, the quest for knowledge is framed as a traumatic endeavor that must be undertaken by the individual, risking everything in order to grasp the true nature of things for its own sake. The Mole People adapts this allegory in a manner that is both less individualist, the light of Ishtar can be conveyed to others, as well as acknowledging the role of non-metaphorical power. The prisoners themselves can be enlightened. It is those who keep them in their shackles who are actually the most possessively invested in maintaining the world of illusions. Nonetheless, Gurug's screenplay ultimately comes to an open ending, with Adad fleeing from the new world of light and Bentley being left behind with nothing to prove what he and Bellaman have learned about the true nature of the world. Adad herself, a personification of Ishtar, becomes like the abstracted, dead statues discovered throughout the rising action of the film, and the world of light above the shadows remains itself still a world of darkness and uncertainty. The microcosmic corruption and ignorance of this buried kingdom has been resolved, but its basis in the broader scope of the world has not. We are still not actually looking up and out, but only up and into infinitely, exponentially expanding darkness. allegory of the cave can certainly be applied, and has very much been applied to a psychoanalytical reading of the cinema. After all, cinema itself is nothing short of light being projected behind passing forms, projecting complex shadows that create the illusion to our minds of whole and present, not just forms, but entire worlds and realms, spaces that we feel are present and ongoing even after they've stopped being projected. In reality, it is our minds that construct this wholeness and presence. But rather than us being shackled in this cave of the cinema is a cave into which we often escape, a world of pleasing shadows that allow us respite from the all-encompassing, terrifying scope of reality and all of its blinding truth. Like all things based on motivation and not on intent, it's hard for me to imagine that the makers of the Mole People were not at least semi-consciously hip to this irony. After all, the movie itself opens with an expert witness telling you, in no uncertain terms, that the film is a fiction. And far from self-serious, this introduction is replete with digressions and conspicuous absences, played in a tongue-in-cheek manner that seems to say to the spectator, we know that you know that this is bullshit, but we also know that you don't care. That in the world of illusions you are, somehow, seeking something that is, as Baxter says, beyond fiction. A truth that can only be represented in shadows, whereas the vast blinding light of true forms is incomprehensible. I realize that I've spent a lot of time reading The Mole People, but said nothing to really substantiate why I think it's actually a good movie. It's perfectly possible that anybody listening to this could find my reading thoroughly convincing, although that's a stretch, I guess. But still, fundamentally disagree that the film isn't a successful... Well, that they might think that this film is still unsuccessful in communicating the themes that I'm mapping out. That it is artistically insubstantial and not technically competent enough, so to speak. But like all I can say to that is this. None of this reading is anything that came about via an instantaneous response to the work itself. It's not the reductive reason why I think the film is good. I think the film is good because it entertains me. If you're not into outlandish plots, pseudoscience, corny humor, low-budget special effects and makeup, the visceral pleasure of seeing men in hunchback mole-person suits slaughtering albinos in tunics, that's not an experience that I can transfer. But I am confident in one thing, which is just as much as my visceral enjoyment of the superficial content of a movie does not necessarily make it good, the obverse visceral response, the instinct for some to merely heckle at it, is not proof that it's poorly done. And that's the critical point we've reached with So Bad It's Good film culture. It's all just the noise of visceral response to being used to gauge the essential worth of something. As if you should be, it's like more and more as I get older, I see an attitude in film culture and discourse which sees it as actually a failure of the film when the spectator doesn't immediately, instinctually get where it's coming from, what is informing it and motivating it artistically. Like, what is the purpose of it? Why do we need it? And then when you break it down for hecklers, the response is always the same. Well, just because you can analyze it and read it doesn't mean it's good. And that's true, but the problem is that I'm not interested in only being immediately entertained or engaged by something I consume. If my actual interest is in the institution of cinema as something that elevates the human experience, then the ability to read something counts a whole hell of a lot. And more to the point, I've seen The Mole People many, many times because I did have that initial visceral enjoyment of it just being a narrative of spectacular, if low-budget sequences. But each time I found something else that never occurred to me about it before. I noticed something else that is making up its artistic DNA, what is informing it. I don't buy this line that good art is something that impresses you immediately. Maybe sometimes it does. But I think, if anything, good art is something that not only rewards, but also requires repeat investment. It requires something beyond mere ritualistic consumption. That's not reductive to the mole people either. I could say that about any number of the B movies we've surveyed on this podcast. The Blob, the Quatermass Experiment, War of the Colossal Beast, The H-Man, the list goes on. And, there's ones we've yet to touch upon, and I'm going to approach them with the same level of good faith and the same investment in reading them as if that were enough to substantiate what's good about them, because I already acknowledge that the visceral response is not substantive enough to actually engage the artistic credibility of something. If I may, the beauty of art is in the quest to look beyond our contentment with the mere shadows. The beauty is in perceiving the purity of forms that lie behind that illusion.